When I was young, I'd listen to the radio, waiting for my favorite
Welcome to the
song.
internationally famous Radio Theatre.
When they played, I'd sing along. It made me smile. Those old melodies still sound so good to me as they melt the years away.
Here they come. Adrian Elsey.
When a girl marries.
Lux Radio Theatre.
Good morning, boys.
Hello, world.
Howdy, everybody.
Van Doogly.
Yibbity, folks.
Good morning, Sammy Sparrow.
What do you say, guys?
It's huge. It is.
The cream of Australian radio talent.
All my best memories come back clearly to me. Some can even make me cry, just like before. It's yesterday once more.
Mr. Jack Davis saying good night and thanks for listening.
40 feet down, 2.5. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Probably the most famous words ever spoken on radio. One of those times when anyone who was alive will remember exactly where they were when they heard the news. Hi, I'm Mike Hammond. Some were able to be near a television set on that day and watch the moment as the flickering images were transmitted back to Earth from the surface of the moon. But for those who were away from home, driving or working outside, as always, it was radio that brought them the news. To look at the story of news broadcasting, here's the man who covered that moon landing for Australian radio, Darren Hinch.
And what a time it was for me. I was the North American correspondent for Fairfax and the Macquarie Network, and I was there to present that moment in history for Australian listeners. A few years later, I brought radio listeners the many exciting developments in another major American news story, the Watergate conspiracy. Radio and news went hand in hand from the very beginning of broadcasting. The first broadcast news was read out from the newspapers. Announcers would literally sit in front of the microphone, turning the pages of the newspaper and read stories they found interesting. Later, radio stations maintained newsrooms within the big newspaper offices, but they also developed their own teams of newshounds and their own news reporting style.
The first truly independent radio news service was set up by the ABC. In fact, news was one of the key reasons behind the establishment of the ABC itself in 1932, much to the chagrin of the newspapers of the day.
This is the news from the ABC, read by Michael Dove. Here are the headlines.
Publishers protested that they shouldn't have to compete with a government-funded competitor, and it was 1936 before the ABC News Division was finally established. Then came the challenge of bringing Australians vital news coverage of World War II, beginning with Prime Minister Menzies' chilling broadcast to the nation in September 1939.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of the persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
Soon, the ABC had access to the international newswires and correspondents around the world. We sat by our radio sets, listening to the latest war news and vivid descriptions of Australia's part in crucial battles.
Well, our bombers are over and they're starting. I see that the German aircraft has started also. Here. Well, that was the sound of the first sticks of bombs. So far, only 5 aircraft shells can I see in the air.
And we had a ritual in our house too. We always had dinner at the table, and Dad and Mum always listened to the 7 o'clock news on the ABC, and we all had to be quiet, and we were not allowed to talk. And if anyone spoke while the news was on, Dad would lean forward and dong one of us, you know, that you get a dong.
Presenting the news became a serious, formal affair, and all stations, ABC and commercial, used their most experienced announcers to read the bulletins. Great emphasis was placed on clear speech and correct pronunciation.
Jimmy Dibble rarely ever
made a mistake. Martin Royal was the same. Heath Burdock on TUE was another one who was in that category.
This is the news from the ABC, read by James Dibble. Here are the headlines. The question of whether Britain and France are about to launch their invasion of Egypt is now claiming world attention.
I thought I was given a wonderful tip by the senior announcer at 2GB, Charles Cousins, that to learn to be an announcer, you should get the leader article of the Sydney Morning Herald and read it aloud every day, accurately, syllable perfect, but try and make it sound as if you're ad-libbing it. But don't change the words. And I used to do that religiously, hour after hour.
Thanks to the radio boom during World War II, commercial radio had the resources to expand their news coverage and hire their own teams of reporters. The Macquarie Network was the first to embellish its news bulletins by adding a revolutionary new effect: recordings of short comments and interview excerpts.
It makes me proud to see how you're overcoming difficulties.
In the mid-1950s, some of the new generation of announcers, the aspiring disc jockeys, got their start presenting the news, and the style and presentation became a little more snappy. One of them was John Laws.
This young man came in. I didn't know much about him. I only learned later that he'd been considered a bit unruly as a young announcer in country stations. But he had this great voice. And I gave him an audition to read some news. It actually took him on as a newsreader.
I'll never forget the first news service I ever read, and I pronounced the word orgasm instead of organism. And a friend of mine who was doing medicine at university at that time rang me and said, you know, it's organism, not orgasm. I'd never heard of the word orgasm in those days.
News on the Hour was another big development.
When I went to 2UE, they had, I think from memory, 3 bulletins a day. One in the breakfast, one about the middle of the day, and one at about 6 o'clock at night. And one of the first things I did was to introduce News on the Hour.
By the 1970s, stations considered the sound of the formal announcing voices was less important than giving the impression of credibility, and journalists took over the presentation of many of the bulletins. But there remained a few skilled newsreaders able to bring both authority and drama to the role.
2SM, it's 12 o'clock. Good afternoon. I'm Jim Angel.
Many of those who've worked in broadcasting will declare the most exciting place to be in a radio station is usually the newsroom.
My very first day at 2UE, the very first time that I walked into that great newsroom at 2UE, there was a huge story breaking. And hearing this guy, this reporter, this legend, Sean Flannery, who was underneath a car protecting himself as bullets flew over the top of him during an exchange of gunfire between a gunman who was holed up in Maggie Taberer's house and shooting at police and reporters out in the street. And here is this guy, this Sean Flannery bloke, live to air reporting this event. Well, I was hooked. That was it.
This area of Peats Ridge Road is considered one of the most dangerous roads in New South Wales and has claimed many lives.
Age Radio News.
It's a cold but fine 12 degrees in Melbourne at 7:30.
Radio stations aiming for the younger market had to learn to package news for young people with little or no interest in politics, government or current affairs. But how do you make a news bulletin entertaining?
That's one story you need straight away. People on the drugs will have to get on that.
One programmer in Sydney, Rod Muir, decided to personalise the news by having the hourly bulletins presented by 3 of radio's best-known commentators.
Also, there's a Canberra story. Can we see CSIRO? We've got to get onto that one straight away.
I was trying to stop the news from being a 3-minute step down of boredom. And that's really what it was.
Go on to Newsroom. Steve, I got that story. You're ready for it now?
I think news has a tendency to get its head up itself and, you know, be terribly introvertedly boring. And I was trying to personalise the news.
And it's taken Christmas, a small boy's birthday, and a recent conversation with fellow parents to make me really appreciate the widespread...
I tried to keep it balanced, and I prided myself, working in radio and television, that I always tried to keep things balanced. Now,
The consumer might not have always agreed, but I have never agreed with broadcasters, past and present, who try to force their opinion down your throat. I've always thought we're using the public airwaves and we have a responsibility. And my responsibility was simply to provide as many sides to any particular story at any particular time.
The stations broadcasting the most news in the modern era belong to the ABC's News Radio network, which began life as a fill-in between broadcasts of proceedings from federal Parliament.
This is the Australian Broadcasting Commission bringing to you, direct from the floor of the National Parliament, the proceedings of the House of Representatives. This is the first time in history of this Commonwealth that the regular day-by-day proceedings of Parliament have been on the air.
Today, the News Radio network runs continuous news and current affairs from around the world and has a devoted following. And now, radio could broadcast Australian news to Australians travelling anywhere in the world thanks to the internet.
Mary McDonald has the details.
Don't we all?
Coupled with news on radio is information. Weather reports and forecasts have been an essential part of radio in country and city since radio's very inception.
This stream that came through last night will give a few cloudy periods near the coast, but in the inland suburbs we won't have any problems at all, just sunshine right through.
Yes, mate, I've got a traffic report on Roseville Bridge. There's a 3-car plane.
Acknowledging its vast commuter audience, radio has given time calls, public transport information and regular traffic reports throughout its metropolitan breakfast and late afternoon programs since the 1950s.
On the Harbour Bridge, traffic is flowing quite well at this stage, and the trains and the ferries are on time as well so far this morning.
At times, it's used small planes, fleets of cars, couriers, taxi networks and even their own helicopters to provide news of traffic hotspots.
If you stuff up the traffic in Sydney, they'll kill you. They want to know how to get home. In fact, part of the conversation when I was there was always, which way do you go home? And I'm thinking, my Lord.
Most radio commentators can remember momentous news events that broke whilst they were on air.
In February 1983 were the Ash Wednesday fires, and the enormity of this disaster sort of became apparent during my shift in the afternoon program. And Whitey came into the studio and he said, look, forget about shift change, just keep going. And so I did, and we did, and that station kept going, broadcasting bushfire news. It became the de facto government, fire brigade, police method of getting information to their people as well as the populace. For days on end, we just went bushfire, bushfire, bushfire.
I was broadcasting live when I was told down my right ear that I was to go immediately to the newsroom because 4 people had been shot dead at Port Arthur in Tasmania. As the game evolved in the next hour, the 4 became 8, became 16, and over 30 people lost their lives that day. And that was one of the most emotional times I've ever known.
Yes, I was on air the day that John F. Kennedy was shot. And I didn't know how to... I was stunned, and I still am to a degree. I just couldn't believe this was happening. This is a man who was almost seen by some people as God on earth. And he'd been shot and killed in America. That was the most awful day.
I remember the morning I was on air that when Princess Diana died. And so we sat there for 3 hours, myself and all the girls, and we just had this incredible love-in, It was really, really moving. It was really extraordinary just to be able to kind of share that. And I thought that all the people who rang in just shared that grief in a very quiet way, and it was really uplifting, I think. It was really cathartic.
For all the drama and history attached to momentous news events around the world, it's still what happens in our own street, suburb, city and state that is often more relevant to our lives. Next, we look at the men and women who have brought us the news, often risking life and limb to keep us informed. They say radio reporters are a special breed, part actor, part adventurer. And to look a little more closely at these performers on the newsbeat, here's one of our great and most controversial talk radio stars. He's a character, Bob Francis.
Thanks, Darren. You know, it takes a certain kind of person to willingly put themselves at a scene of death and destruction, or to confront angry mobs or chase down elusive crooks. Horror, anguish and despair can often be a part of a radio reporter's day. But I guarantee you most of them will tell you there's no other job they'd rather do.
Perhaps the most challenging role for a radio reporter has been that of the war correspondent.
It was a very scary thing to do at times, really scary. Occasionally when you got shot at, that was super scary. But I loved it because your adrenaline's pumping, you're covering the big story, you're getting the stuff back. And that is the, I suppose, ultimate goal of any journalist, is to cover the big story.
This is commercial station 2GB Sydney, key station of the Macquarie Broadcasting Service. In a few moments, we bring you the midday feature program, Macquarie Newsreel, edited and presented by Bill Weir.
In 1946, the Macquarie Network began airing a feature news program, Macquarie Newsreel, providing short interviews with people in the news and reporters' descriptions of news events.
Oh, well, I own a furniture shop in Maitland, and I've just about lost everything I've got, but I guess there's plenty of people worse off than I am.
The ABC used its national network to gather background features on news from all over Australia and package them into one show called News Review. The program also featured what publicity of the time described breathlessly as recordings of eyewitness accounts of news events. Technology at that time was primitive, and radio reporters out on the road were weighed down by heavy wire recorders.
The only problem with wire recorders was that if the wire was used excessively, it would heat up and it would stretch out and become thin. So you would start possibly on the wire recorder when it was being played on air as a very nice deep baritone, but if you struck a stretch of the wire that had thinned out, you'd wind up like a soprano.
In the 1950s, Macquarie launched Monitor, a daily feature program designed to expand and explain news from home and abroad.
I'm pleased and proud to be the first Australian ever to fight and win the world's title.
John Pearce would take out this whopping great black reel-to-reel with a microphone. These long before the days of silicon chips and portability and all the rest of it. And he would go out and he would interview people, all sorts of people.
It's exciting, it's entertaining, it's different, it's Monitor.
With the lighter, more portable, magnetic tape machines, reporters were able to get their microphones much closer to the newsmakers.
Where does all the money go? Well, a lot of it goes to Her Majesty. She's a millionaire.
In 1954, Gary O'Callaghan used one of the new recorders to capture the drama at Sydney Airport, when Soviet agents forced the wife of a defecting Russian diplomat onto a plane bound for Moscow.
And I actually got in front of Mrs. Petrov, who was sobbing and crying and so on, and they grabbed hold of one of the couriers, and that was my opportunity to get underneath, to put the microphone in front of Mrs. Petrov from behind, because you couldn't get in front anymore. And then the crowd let this bloke go and his arm came back down, so I was in a headlock, still with the microphone through. And it was then I felt the firearm in this fella's holster.
Mrs. Petrov is being held back by several people. And now the gangplank is being lowered away from the ship. Men are trying to hold the gangplank against the plane. And the Russian couriers are trying desperately to force their way. And they're brought there. Punches are being thrown by the people. And the Russian couriers will not get her across. There's going to be an accident here. And so the gangplank is dragged away from the plane. And there they are, stranded right on the top.
From the 1960s, radio reporters had two-way radios in their news cars that allowed them to report on events as they happened. The introduction of talkback technology then allowed them to report from anywhere they could find a telephone. Darren Hinch was a young newspaper foreign correspondent in America when he covered the first moonwalk in July 1969 for Brian White on the Macquarie Network via telephone.
20 seconds and counting.
So I just started my first work in May, and then I was covering men going to the moon, and I did the blast-off from Cape Canaveral.
Ignition sequence start.
And I remember they put me through, and Brian was holding down the fort at 2GB, and he said, OK, you're on air. And I had like 5 minutes before blast-off. So I ad-libbed for 4.5, 5 minutes. And then it just, it was awesome. It was the best broadcast I've ever done.
Telephones also allowed radio presenters in the studio to talk directly with people caught up in the news events, such as Melbourne's Queen Street massacre in 1987.
I had people calling me who were hiding under desks in buildings opposite the building where the shooting was because they thought the guy was rampaging around the city. And they were ringing saying, can we come out yet? Now that impressed me with the immediacy and the reach of radio and also the responsibility of radio.
The most memorable piece of radio I've ever heard was live, Murray Nicol broadcasting the burning down of his own house in the Adelaide Hills.
Neil, at the moment, I'm watching my house burn down. I'm sitting out on the road in front of my own house where I've lived for 13 or 14 years. It's going down in front of me. The roof is falling and it's in flames and there's nothing I can do about it. Absolutely nothing. There's been a fire unit here from Summertown pumping water till we ran out and the flames are in the roof and God damn it.
Radio reporters have often found themselves becoming part of the drama of major accidents, shootings and sieges.
I was standing over the scene, looking down, seeing the police and the standoff situation. The 5 hostages were all in the car and they all had the gun held at their throat. I'm reporting direct to air. And after about 10 or 15 minutes of this very tense situation happening, a Crown Sergeant came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, you're going to have to stop this. Go back to the studio. And I said, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he said, the guy is listening to you in the car. We can't negotiate because he's listening to what you're talking about.
News reporting may be an exciting profession, but there's a dark side as well.
The fella from the rescue squad asked me to help him while he called for an ambulance. And he reached over and he put my hand into the throat of the fellow who had been injured in the front seat, where he had actually cut, the arteries in his throat were cut and there was blood everywhere. We were both covered in this guy's blood.
Yeah, so these 3 blokes looked down into the valley, and I kid you not, it was like Hell's Kitchen. There was mist and smoke down in the valley and this red glow underneath it. And on the way down, we found 2 kids who'd actually been incinerated against the wall. And the flame had come up and got them. And they were giving me the names of the survivors that they had down there. And I was writing those names down on a piece of paper to give to this Glenn Graham. And unfortunately, one of the parents suddenly finds their child's name is not there. And I still think about it.
Among the highest rating programs in Australian radio have been the compiles of dramatic Saturday night local news for the big Sunday morning audience.
This is Clive Waters, news editor, 3UZ. The tragic events of the past 24 hours have shocked the world. With a special edition of Newsbeat, here is feature editor, John Ford.
So he was Philip Brady, who'd always played the clown, you know, and Graham Kennedy called me Dimples, and I'd always been a bit of a lightweight. But here I was out with a microphone on a Saturday night, covering some horrendous accidents in Melbourne, and that gave me a different string to my bow.
In Sydney, 2UE's Night Watch ran for more than 20 years, from the 1960s to the 1980s.
95 2UE, the news leader, presents Night Watch, the stories behind the action, with David Allender. This was Sydney last night.
Car crashes, fires, murders, stabbings, anything that involved some sort of drama that was occurring in Sydney on a Saturday night. All of the material will be brought back to the station at about 5 o'clock in the morning and edited down into a very slick half hour of highly paced actuality for a radio program that ran between 9 and 9:30.
Sean Flannery was a great journalist, and so was David Allender. They were always out there chasing down stories, every rabbit down every hole. Nothing stopped them, and they were intensely competitive. So they were always a great inspiration to everybody else to get out there and just get the bloody story.
Rising costs gradually reduced the size of radio newsrooms. Today, the half-hour news bulletin is a rarity on commercial stations, and most only send their own reporters to the most important news events.
The strategists on both sides agree that
The ABC, on the other hand, maintains a large stable of local and international reporters who file stories for regular lengthy news bulletins, as well as in-depth news and current affairs programs, morning, noon and night.
That's all in tonight's edition of PM. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. I'm Mark Colvin. Thanks for being with me this evening. Good night.
Radio reporters are expected to report the facts and leave the opinions to the personalities in the studio. Of course, many a young reporter has graduated to the role of commentator, or as some of their critics sarcastically call them, oracle or guru. Coming up next, the radio commentators who help us make sense of the news.
There is not one marriage in the world which is smooth forever and which has been smooth since the day it began. There is not one marriage in which there has never been a flaming row.
The thundering sound of Eric Boehm, one of Australia's most charismatic radio commentators. Boehm was a former war correspondent and newspaper editor, and he had an opinion on everything. But he was only one in a long line of broadcasters delivering colourful editorials and helping listeners interpret current events. Today, the airwaves are filled with opinions from both the program presenters and their listeners. And to help us look at the evolution of Australian radio current affairs, here's one of our best-known broadcasters, Bob Rogers.
Thank you, Bob. There are no exams a radio presenter has to pass to be permitted to express an opinion on air. You'd think the minimum requirement would be the ability to speak clearly, be able to string a sensible sentence together, and to have a good general knowledge. Not so.
That'll never catch on. Paul Keating says, what goes up, stays up.
Lights, it's life according to Arch.
We've got too many wimpy little minority groups
Arch
dictating to government.
He may not change history, but he will change your nights. Weeknights from 7 and Saturdays from 6.
You are with Arch Tambackers on 1070 2KY.
The first commentators on Australian radio were people who gave what were referred to in the 1930s as talks. But in 1953 came the radio's first man they loved to hate, Eric Boehm, who presented provocative and passionate shows with names like I'm on Your Side and Say What You Think. Boehm came to radio when he was already middle-aged, after a colourful career as a newspaper editor, author and war correspondent.
Absolutely correct. Our treatment of the migrants at times is more than disgusting. And it's a wonder how decent men and women can put up with some of us. Yes, that is perfectly true.
Another veteran journalist, Ormsby Wilkins, made his reputation on radio as an editorialist in Sydney and Melbourne.
Now, Ormsby did these editorials which were mind-blowing. He had a very gruff voice. He wasn't a natural broadcaster. I remember him getting on air one day and saying, nationalism is the curse of the world. That was the way Ormsby broadcast.
In 1969, 2GB Macquarie manager Des Foster decided to reverse the talkback format. Rather than having listeners dialed in, Brian White, by then Macquarie's news editor, began an afternoon current affairs program in which he would dial out and interview people in the news.
He would find new angles in a story that were in the morning papers and he would expand on it. He would see the questions that hadn't been asked, the information that hadn't been given. He ran a most successful afternoon show. Of course, before that he started in Macquarie News and Monitor and some of the early current affairs shows.
There's a strange collection of things to report on and discuss here today. Who is making money out of the oil crisis is one thing, mental health is another, crime is another.
The show was an instant hit and spawned a whole new genre of dial-out current affairs radio.
This is Brian White. I'll be back at 10.
Brian White was a fearless broadcaster. He was not only not afraid to walk on eggshells, he was quite happy to crush them. He had a view, and he had a beautifully soft way of whipping you to death with velvet.
Brian was an extraordinary man. He had vision, and the thing I loved about Brian was he would recognise somebody's talent, nurture it.
For many years, breakfast time on commercial radio was considered to be the lighter time of day. Hard-nosed editorials weren't what people wanted to hear first thing in the morning.
It's disgraceful, it's outrageous, it's monstrous.
Then along came Jones.
Is that the beneficial way to use taxpayers' money?
One of Australia's most successful broadcasters, Alan Jones began his radio career on morning radio in the 1980s. But it wasn't until he moved to breakfast, after John Law's return to 2UE in 1988, that he swept to the top of the Sydney radio ratings.
Something has to be done. Give us a call.
Thank you. A lot of us made the mistake of thinking Alan's a great communicator and a brilliant after-dinner speaker and a motivational speaker and has coached the Wallabies. And they said, but he won't be any good on radio. He's got a squeaky voice and he technically he's no good.
And if you don't like the heat of the questioning, really we shouldn't be here.
Oh, I'm quite prepared to stay here.
OK, well, if you can't take the heat, you're famous saying you should get out of the kitchen, but it's a nonsense to say I'm advocating. What I've just proposed to you is the truth. You are not paying a fringe benefits tax on Kirribilli House or the Lodge. You're not paying it on your VIP flights.
Alan, you won't get me upset by this. Let me just make the point.
Well, answer the question.
I will.
This man who was had graduated from Oxford, who was a script writer and an advisor to the Prime Minister, who was a school teacher at King's School, who was a rugby union coach and had taken the team and won the Grand Slam, the first in history, who'd taken on a team the year before and won the premiership for the first time for them in 30 years, a man who loved opera, who loved comedy, who loved theatre, a fellow who was who made the quarterfinals in doubles at Wimbledon, playing tennis. And I thought, how can I miss with this guy? You wouldn't have to be a rocket scientist. I think, you know, he's somebody that can do well.
I'll be back tomorrow morning at the same time between 5:30 and 10. Ray coming up after the news. Stay with us here on 2GB 873. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Others also found they could make breakfast a success with a serious commentary show.
Brendan Favola has been given a week off because his body language was bad. Oh, Jesus, some inconsistencies in football.
Neil Mitchell in Melbourne is a terrific broadcaster. There's a fella called Ross Stevenson, does breakfast at 3AW, a lawyer. Now, there's a worthwhile lawyer. He's just a great communicator because he talks about his footy team, he talks about the kids, he talks about the fact that he stuffed up his tax, and he can just communicate. Yeah.
Probably the earliest and the most passionate opinions on radio came from the sporting commentators. No one loves sport more than Australians, and radio was quick to adapt to the demands for sporting coverage. Next up, the days when horse racing ruled the airwaves. If there's one social activity that's brought Australians together over the years more than any other, it's a horse race. So it was inevitable that radio audiences would demand complete coverage of the races. And here is a man whose name is synonymous with horse racing, Johnny Tapp.
Thanks, Bob. In the 1920s, it was common for more than 60,000 people
to attend a Saturday feature race meeting in Melbourne or Sydney. Radio would eventually bring the races to millions more in homes and pubs around the country. The first race callers soon developed their famous full description, a style of race calling that is still unique in the world.
It's Riesling and Eyeliner fighting it out tooth and nail with CDS and Peace Council coming hard. Eyeliner, folks, it's Bev in front. Riesling giving plenty, but Eyeliner's too good. Eyeliner first, Riesling second, CDS third, fourth, Peace Council.
The voice of the great Ken Howard, just one of a long line of much-loved stars of racing radio stretching back to the 1930s.
I mean, the guys who preceded Ken, like Eric Welsh and Freddie Tupper and probably Keith Dunby, they had a style that was quieter. And then on the ABC, there was Joe Brown, of course, followed them in Melbourne. They had a bloke called Wallace Sharland used to call the football and also the races in those early days.
And a furlong from home, you can say that Russia has the race safely won. Carey is finishing on gamely, but far too late, and Russia strode in by a great margin.
And people said, nobody will ever replace Eric Welsh. And in the 50s, when he left to run a pub down at Mornington, Bill Collins came, and miracle of miracles, Bill Collins was better than Eric.
Bone Crusher responds to the whip, the roars of the crowd. He races up to our Waverley Star, 100 out. Bone Crusher, our Waverley Star, stride for stride, nothing in it. Our Waverley Star, the rails, Bone Crusher the outside, and Bone Crusher races into equine immortality.
Bill Collins called races with such skill, he became known as the accurate one, and his bright personality saw him develop into a popular all-round entertainer.
And a man came up to me and he said, I'm going to kiss you.
Ooh, what did you do?
Well, I said, if you kiss me, I'll clock you.
And did you?
Yeah, he kissed me, I clocked him. It took him 1 minute and 37 seconds.
In the days when racing relied totally on the admission prices of the punters attending the track, the clubs attempted to prevent radio broadcasts. But race callers simply climbed a tree or got themselves a stepladder and a pair of binoculars and called races from outside the track. Some criminals worked out ways to delay the early racing broadcasts until they'd backed the winner with off-course bookmakers. As well as calls of the races, radio also provided expert commentary and detailed form guides for the punters, hosted by racing experts like Macquarie's Cliff Carey.
We used to get the racing roundup. We'd come in from working outside and you get the racing roundup. But Cliff Carey seemed to know everything. I thought, this bloke's an encyclopedia. He knows everything.
Now, looking down through the field, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the old horse Lourdes proved the hardest for Darkman to beat. And Lourdes, on relative handicapping, is perhaps the best handicap runner in the field.
Cliff Carey's Macquarie Network racing team included his son Garth and a talented young broadcaster, Ray Warren.
I became a fan, if you like, of Ken Howard, so much to the point that I would come home from school and roll marbles down a slope and call them as horses and try and imitate Ken Howard as much as I possibly could.
Ray Warren would graduate from radio race and football calling to his own talk shows before moving to a stellar career in television calling rugby league and swimming. His boyhood hero, Ken Howard, was one of radio's true originals, setting trends in race calling that others would follow for years to come.
Inch by inch, it's Tulloch coming at 100 miles an hour, but sharply in front with a half furlong left to run. Tulloch is feeling his weight under the 9.13. He's game as a bulldog going out after Sharpley, but Sharpley's in front, and Sharpley wins the Sydney Cup from Tulloch.
He was such an easygoing, old-time fellow. You know, it was as though we were living in the 1930s, and Ken was there being the racing expert. He was so good. You couldn't flummox him.
Ken Howard's successor was a young man who stood by as his apprentice for many years before taking over the reins. John Tapp.
The thing that attracted me to race calling more than any other single factor was the tantalising manner in which Ken Howard did the job. To hear that man calling a race at home on a Saturday afternoon would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. He brought the excitement of the track into people's living rooms. It was so exciting, so tantalising, so wonderful.
Johnny Tapp inherited a phenomenal tradition and added to it. So he grew that tradition. And a nice man and wonderfully accurate caller.
Livingstone Lane is the leader. Down the outside is Twiglet. Look at Superimpose. He's come through between horses. He's going to do it. It's history at Randwick. Superimpose has come from last and he wins his second Epsom.
Another of the callers who made entertainment a priority in his broadcasts was Melbourne's Bert Bryant.
And when he had the two-horse war, remember, it was just a match race between Big Faloo and Rain Lover. And he had to fill in the time. It's a great lesson for radio, to fill in the time.
And Roy Higgins is bowling along and Big Faloo couldn't give a hang at this particular stage. I would think he would be thinking about his little daughter at home, only a week old.
And he said, over there, they're still queuing up to come in today, and there's a few people will be unhappy because the car park's full. Anyway, Big Faloo, there's been no change, he said.
Front Highland got Higgins' money too over the birth of that baby, being a daughter and not a son. And you can bet your sweet life that Higgins here is after it back, and Highland is just as anxious to keep it because it's pretty hard to get.
And this wonderful story, he just introduced everything.
Big Faloo's got his head in front. I think the champ has gone on the outside. Big Faloo's got a long head in front. Rain Lover coming again. Big Faloo, Rain Lover, they go to the line together. Oh, photo. Big Faloo has won it by a nose. Big Faloo has won it, I feel anyway. By gee, I hope so. You'd hate to be wrong in a two-horse race. You'd have to give it up forever and go back to work.
Bryant conducted a hugely popular racing panel program, which ran for over 2 decades.
Turf Talk on 3UZ.
Let me introduce the panel. We've got Joe Miller.
Hello, Bert. Good morning, everybody.
Jack Arling. Good morning, Jack. Good morning. And don't you try and talking about that. It reminds me of the story of the very attractive blonde who was watching the Salvation Army band play at the corner of Burke Street and Russell Street one Sunday night. And when the collection box came around, she dropped a $5 bill in it. And the captain said, "That's very kind of you, madam." He said, "Would you like a special hymn?" She said, "Yes, that big bloke on the drums."
Around Australia, there have been many other distinctive race callers, all with their own unique style. Men like Des Hoisted.
But Rose of Kingston's got the Derby won. She's making history. Go, Rosie. Go. She's got it won. Rose of Kingston a length and a quarter.
Ian Craig.
And Desert War racing away for a brilliant win in the Epsom. Desert War from our Egyptian Reignin to Sumo.
And Vince Curry.
Tulloch put his head in front of sharply, a half furlong out, followed by Drumcondra. Tulloch on the outside is just in front. Listen to the crowd. It's Tulloch's Cup.
The ABC also produced many great callers, including Jeff Marnie in Sydney and Melbourne's Joe Brown.
Rimfire half a length in front of Dark Man. They're both under pressure. A titanic struggle in the front of the boat. Dark Man finishing on I Can't Pick It.
Every racing enthusiast has their favourites, and like other fields of broadcasting, the challenges of the job change with the times and the technology.
You see, it's very hard to compare callers from different eras, particularly, say, the more Greg Miles, Alan Thomas, Ian Craig, the callers that are modern-day callers, the modern-day greats. They're under much, much more pressure than the late Ken Howard and Bert Bryant.
Today, racing on radio is controlled by the corporations licensed to manage the tote betting, with satellite television providing live coverage of most regional and city race meetings. Racing on radio in metropolitan Australia is mostly confined to one station. But as always, those on the move, at work or play, who want to follow horse racing can still switch on their radio. Coming up next, how sport became a staple of radio and still captivates millions of Australians.
Just as sporting contests stir the hearts of most Australians, so radio has from its birth given us the very latest sporting results. Then as soon as radio learned how to take its microphones outside the studio, eager young commentators were describing the progress of cricket, boxing, tennis, swimming, running and golf. What better place to start exploring radio's sporting history than with the one game we can truly call our own, that unique football code known as Australian rules. Australian football started in 1858 when a couple of Melbourne private schools were looking for a game to keep their cricketers fit during winter. It's said that wherever you are in Australia, on any winter's Saturday afternoon, you can hear a radio call of the Big Aussie Rules match of the day in Melbourne.
Radio's first coverage of Australian rules football, the VFL semi-final of 1925, was a chatty affair that didn't even include a description of the play. But broadcasters soon developed their now familiar, colourful descriptions of every moment of the game. In the years that followed, in all the southern states and Western Australia, dozens of footy callers became true superstars of radio. Among the most popular was Norman Banks, who began describing football in the 1930s on 3KZ. Initially, the VFL banned Banks from the grounds, fearing, just like the racing clubs, that detailed and exciting broadcasts would reduce football attendances. And just like the race callers, Banks simply set up a stand and broadcast from outside the grounds.
No one around the ground, very few people expected him to do this. It was only about 35 yards out, but he kicked it straight through the centre. And Carlton still keeping their mind on the game, and they're battling it out. And just for the last 5 minutes, they look much more determined, Doug.
Among the many others who've called the game was Harry Beitzel, whose calls in the 1960s were so authoritative, he came to be known as the voice of football.
He's put the ball under his arm like a rugby tackle, bounced it 3 times. Now he's going round that player, bounced it 4 times, Manassa has a shot at goal, into a goal, he puts it through, he's put it through, what a goal! A lone effort by Manassa from the half-back line.
And he was just a dynamo. He was so energetic, and the enthusiasm rubbed off on everyone else, you know what I mean? And that's why they called him the Big H. You know, you sat next to Big H in the box and the whole box rocked, you know what I mean?
Radio's modern AFL coverage is presented by teams of broadcasters whose celebrity matches that of the game's biggest stars.
The 7-12, Richmond 8-5, back with BT, Spud and Gaz. After this, thanks to Vodafone's News and Sports Pack, Triple M rocks football.
Buckley through 50, 49, 48 metres for a goal! And the stadium had erupted in euphoria!
And many callers, such as the great Dennis Cometti, have been able to excel in describing a range of sporting events, such as swimming and athletics. In Perth, king of the callers for many years was George Grilizic, who spent 47 years in sports broadcasting and broadcast at 6 Olympic Games. Grilizic's call of Ben Johnson's world record 100-metre sprint at the 1988 Seoul Olympics is regarded as one of the best of all time. He spoke 53 words and 9 sentences in just under 10 seconds.
Johnson got away well, Williams got away quickly, so did Mitchell. Lewis was slow, so too was Christie. Johnson in front of the halfway by a metre. Lewis might not get up. Johnson's going to win it. Johnson wins by a metre from Lewis. Christie is third. Put it in by Smith.
9.79, a world
9.79, it's a world record to Ben Johnson.
Another great sports broadcast all-rounder is Tim Lane.
His track and field commentary at the Olympic Games, absolutely stunning. A brilliant cricket commentator, Aussie rules caller, nothing he couldn't lend a hand to.
In Sydney, the working men who'd migrated from the industrial cities of the English Midlands brought with them a tough and gritty form of rugby, which eventually came to be called rugby league. The early radio callers of the game were broadcasters who'd learned their craft providing blow-by-blow descriptions of boxing bouts. Throughout the Depression and the war years, the boxing was a sport followed by millions of Australians, and the champion fighters were heroes to boys everywhere.
1940s, that was the era of Patrick, Dawson and all those fighters through to the 50s, and boxing was the major sport just about in Sydney. I think it was on 2 or 3 stations, Cyril Angles, Eric Walker. You know, there was quite an array of boxing commentators, and I thought they were pretty good.
But the fight's over. He can't make it and Burns is out. Patrick is still champion.
Welcome back now to the
Melbourne
white corner.
also had a famous fight commentator named Ron Casey.
The Australian light middleweight champion, Sharky Raymond.
One early boxing and rugby league caller was Reg Grundy, who would later become the TV game show king. Grundy's successor was Frank Hyde, who would go on to be Sydney's leading caller of rugby league for 31 years on 2SM. Hyde had been a player, coach, sports administrator, journalist and charity worker.
If I get through today's broadcast, it will be my 21st consecutive grand final description.
Generations of league fans heard his signature expression describing a kick for goal.
He moves into it, and there it goes. Well, it's high enough, it's long enough too, if it's straight. Oh, a beautiful kick! It came around in an arc, and a beautiful kick right from the touchline by Mick Cronin.
One of Hyde's most memorable calls was at the 1963 Grand Final, played in atrocious conditions at the Sydney Cricket Ground.
And I used to broadcast from the touchline, sitting there with umbrellas and well, it's not as it is now, I can tell you. We didn't have the mod cons that they have these days.
Hyde's great rival on Sydney's 2KY was Tiger Black.
Tiger Black was an entity unto himself. Loved him, he was just so jovial.
Among the many other great rugby league callers were Cole Pearce, Peter Peters and Greg Hartley, known to their fans as Hollywood and Zorba, and Brisbane's George Lovejoy and Billy J. Smith.
Remember 1970.
Back it comes to Threlfo, only seconds remaining. Bally's not giving a thing away, and it goes to Scanlon. There's the full time hooter, and it's all over. Bally's have got up to win. Bally's defeating Norths 15-13. Oh, what a game of rugby league.
The modern era has seen the rise of Ray Hadley as the premier caller in the game.
Here's the ball to Warford. Great ball! Oh, Stewart into Paula! And Brett Stewart scores the most magnificent try. Hang on, he wants to have another look. Don't start putting it up yet. They want to have one more look at it. But I think you'll find it 6-0 kick to come. Desi's looking at me. I'm bucking if I know Des.
Radio has excelled at producing a wide range of football commentators, all with their own unique styles, including Triple J's John Doyle and Greg Pickhaver, better known as Roy and HG, who found success mixing the serious with the absurd.
I think there's something peculiarly Australian about Roy and HG, not just because they've got the sort of Aussie accents and thing, but there's something irreverent and subversive and that isn't class conscious at all that I think is delicious. Delicious.
The Olympics was always a big event for radio, even in the years after the coming of television. The Olympics was an all-day affair, and radio has always been unbeatable in bringing events to listeners when they're out and about at work or at play.
Here comes the Australians goal. 5 metres. 4, 3, 2, 1. Goals! Goal to Australia! Goals!
And that was the 4x100 medley relay in Moscow in 1980. The games were there, and the Australian team was Mark Kerry, who swam backstroke, Peter Evans, who swam breaststroke, Mark Tonelli swam butterfly, and Neil Brooks swam freestyle.
His calls of some of those great Olympic Games events at the pool are legendary, because he was doing the splits in his own mind at the same time as calling the event. So he always seemed to know when a world record could be coming up.
For decades, Australians everywhere have thrilled to radio's coverage of the international cricket. Alan McGilvray is still widely recognised as Australian radio's greatest cricket broadcaster.
I learned more about cricket watching the game, as it were, through his eyes, sitting behind him in the commentary box, than playing it or talking to players. He was number one.
Perhaps the most famous cricket broadcast of all was in the 1930s, when shortwave radio transmission from England to Australia was unreliable. Sound effects were devised to give the sound of the bat hitting the ball and the applause of the crowd.
This ball well pitched, Brabham moves forward, drives. Cotton at cover tries to cut it off, but is beaten by the pace of the ball, and it races away for another 4.
Alan McGilvray, AM MBE, was a cricket commentator for 50 years. He died in 1996 at the age of 87. His memory is preserved in the Alan McGilvray Medal, awarded to the player named the ABC's Test Cricketer of the Year. Today, there are tens of millions of radios in our homes, beside our beds, in the kitchen, our cars, our pockets, even our beach bags. And as we listen, we can picture in our minds whatever we like, from the drama of a crime scene to the antics of a clown at breakfast time. Today, we never have to miss a thing. We can download a podcast from the internet and replay it on our personal players. Thanks to the invention of that very first transistor and its wondrous offspring, the computer chip, we can listen on the internet to tens of thousands of radio stations. And no matter where we are in the world, if we can access an internet browser, we can listen to Australian radio, bringing us the news and relieving us of our homesickness. Australian radio has, of course, produced thousands of talented broadcasters in all the various program styles of news, talk, sports, and the many music formats. In support behind the scenes have been all those in production, sales, engineering, programming, and management. We acknowledge them all. And to you, the audience, without whom none of us would have been able to work in this industry we love so much, thanks for listening.